right, day 2 follow-up. Bob Enyart confessing to the murder of JonBenet Ramsey by making up stories about the DNA today. So we'll see.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. I am Bob Enyart, the pastor of Denver Bible Church. Welcome to part 2 and the conclusion of our Clue That Breaks the Case 2013 on the JonBenet Ramsey murder and the key to understanding all the evidence. Because some of the evidence, some people say it seems to contradict. Looks like it should convict the Ramseys, some looks exculpatory. Well, the one part of the story of the crime that explains the evidence that looks exculpatory is that after things got out of control and the Ramseys killed their daughter, that wasn't how the night started out. They didn't intend to do that.
Oh.
When they killed their daughter, they thought through how to deflect attention. They didn't want to look guilty, so they came up with a plan for John Ramsey to leave the home, and in order to basically make it look like someone else committed the crime, to plant some exculpatory evidence. We'll explain how that goes, and also the clue that breaks the case is the line in the ransom note. Now, there's a lot that shows that this is the case, but the line in the ransom note where the Ramseys are asleep and allegedly an intruder's in the house writing a lengthy ransom note, the FBI points out that kidnappers for profit, they don't molest the person they're kidnapping before they kidnap them. They never leave the body in the home when they want to kidnap for profit. Right? Child molesters, they don't write ransom notes. So this is a crime that doesn't fit any category other than the parents are trying to get away with it.
Oh.
And so
Sure.
when they, excuse me, one second.
Yeah.
And so when they realized that they had killed their daughter, they tried to come up with a way to deflect attention. And to do that, John Ramsey would have to leave the home. And so in the ransom note that Patsy Ramsey wrote has this absurd line, I advise you to be rested, which you're going to tell parents who are asleep at around midnight to be rested because you're going to call them at 8 o'clock in the morning. So once we put together the story and see what actually happened, then each of these pieces of information will make sense. So let's pick up where we left off yesterday. By the way, if you read the Denver Post, now the Denver Post cannot be trusted. You'll think, well, the DNA evidence proved it's not the Ramseys. It's got to be somebody else. Well, the Denver Post, and like the Daily Camera in Boulder, you know, they tend to find ways to ignore or downplay outright crimes or incompetence by leading governing officials and by Colorado's elite, like the Denver mayor for using prostitutes, right? They do a good job reporting on that. Or the Jefferson County Sheriff denying the existence of the search warrant application for Eric Harris prior to Columbine. Did they do a good job exposing that? Or how about the Arapahoe County Sheriff re-addicting boys, young men, to crack cocaine in order to use them sexually? How'd they do on that case?
That's what he's doing.
So the Denver Post is an apologist for the Colorado elite, and so they can't be trusted. Now let's continue. We were going through the bullets of the case, and if you recall, we saw that Patsy Ramsey called at about 5 minutes to 6 in the morning, December 26th, told the police her daughter was missing. She found a ransom note. Minutes later, family and friends started coming to the Ramsey home. The ransom note is absurd. It actually compliments John Ramsey's business, which has got to be a first in the history of ransom notes.
Obviously.
It mentions all kinds of quirky details that are details to his life. It says, I advise you to be well rested. And then there's these little insults toward John, like, don't try to grow a brain, John. Don't underestimate us, John. We are a small foreign faction. no small foreign faction refers to themselves as a small foreign faction. So at any rate, the neighbors heard a loud noise, saw a flashlight in the kitchen the night before around midnight. The Ramseys' flashlight was found by the police on the kitchen counter, which it normally wasn't there. The police 5 times asked Patsy Ramsey for handwriting samples, believing that she wrote the ransom note. The district attorney led the public to believe that the grand jury could not agree on an indictment when it turns out they did vote to indict the Ramseys on child abuse leading to death.
Guilty of?
That was quite a sleight of hand by Alex Hunter, and it's partly because the Colorado media tends to whitewash the incompetence of our elite, the political elite especially. No signs of forced entry. Detective Linda Arndt, who's the only one on the scene for hours and hours, like 7 hours, she's on the scene, and the rest of the Boulder Police Department are AWOL. Until she finally calls and says, by the way, this kidnapping is now a murder scene. We found the body. Finally, the police show up, the rest of the police. And she says the Ramseys didn't spend the morning hours in each other's company. They stayed in separate rooms. John Ramsey reading his mail. And the ransom note said there would be a call between 8 and 10 a.m. 10 o'clock comes, the deadline for the call, and neither of the Ramseys make any remark whatsoever about why hasn't the kidnapper called. They weren't even waiting for the call.
Were you there, like you know?
Arndt suggested that Mr. Ramsey search the home, and he and neighbor friend Fleet White came upon JonBenet's corpse in the basement. And John Ramsey picked up the lifeless body of his daughter, brought it upstairs. And when Mrs. Ramsey saw the body, about the first thing she pointed out, she said, she pointed to the underwear that JonBenet was wearing. We covered this yesterday. And she said, where did they come from? They don't belong here. What's with this? It's an oversized underwear that was on JonBenet. And she pretended she had never seen that underwear. Turns out that the detectives, with extraordinary work, that they succeeded in answering many, many questions. And there ended up being a rift between the detectives and the DA's office. So Alex Hunter became the ally of the Ramseys and the enemy of his own investigators. So the detectives found the receipt for that pair of underwear from Bloomingdale's in Manhattan, and it turns out the family friends knew the story of that pair of underwear. Now, how many of you out there have underwear that your friends know the story about the underwear? How many?
Why do you know this story?
Well, this underwear they were bought as a gift for a niece who was 6 years older than JonBenet. But JonBenet, undoubtedly being a spoiled brat, how she's being raised by her parents, threw a fit that she didn't want them given as a gift. She wanted them. So rather than correcting her daughter, Patsy Ramsey said, okay, gave in, and put the underwear up on her daughter's shelf in her closet till her daughter grew older. So then that underwear that Patsy Ramsey feigned no knowledge of turned out to be underwear with a story. And the reason Patsy Ramsey pointed to that pair of underwear was to misdirect the police into thinking it must have been an intruder. So she knew exactly, John Ramsey knew exactly why she was wearing that underwear. That was part of their mini, quickly put together plan to deflect attention and to try to put together some kind of exculpatory evidence that made it look like there was an intruder. So we told the story last night. John Ramsey even misreported the night before when they came home. He said JonBenet was sleeping in the car and he carried her right to the bedroom. Turns out that the coroner found what looked like pineapple in her stomach, and the party they were at had no pineapple, but their kitchen table had pineapple.
I know.
The table in the dining room, on the dining room table. So even that part of the story, you know, if your daughter's asleep when you get home, it makes it sound like, well, of course, you know, parents wouldn't have done anything. She was asleep, but she wasn't asleep.
Oh, maybe he found her eating pineapple.
Let's get to Patsy Ramsey being exhausted and lying down after they find the body of JonBenet, and she reaches up and touched the face of her friend, Pam Griffin. Now, that's the woman who had made JonBenet's pageant costumes. Griffin thought that Patsy was delirious when she asked, "Couldn't you fix this for me?" as though a sewing machine might bring her daughter back. And she then remembers Patsy saying, "We didn't mean for this to happen." This is the family friend who was there. Says she remembers Patsy saying, "We didn't mean for this to happen." And Griffin got the definite feeling that in her weakened condition, Patsy had revealed that at least she knew who the killer was. The Ramseys have often resisted cooperating with the ongoing investigation, as, for example, on February 19th, 1997, when they refused to allow police to interview John's oldest son, John Andrew. A known feud developed early on between the detectives and Alex Hunter, the DA, in his office. Accusations of conflict of interest suggested the reason for Hunter's frequent conflict with the detectives and sheltering of the Ramseys. By the way, we're going through The Clue That Breaks the Case from 14 years ago that we published here at Bob Enyart Live. On January 16th, 1998, the Ramseys refused a police request for a second interview. But on June 25th, 1998, they allow whose office to question them? Alex Hunter's office, of course. So they could say to the media and the Christian publisher, Thomas Nelson, they could buy a hook, line, and sinker that the Ramseys are innocent. Thomas Nelson published a book that the Ramseys were innocent, titled The Death of Innocence. And guess what was on the cover? Guess what was on the cover? JonBenet? No. A picture, a photo of John and Patsy Ramsey. So, from the moment their daughter was killed, their focus was themselves. Their focus was themselves. Death of innocence, it's them. How dare you think that they could be guilty?
Oh, my God.
So they allowed the DA's office to question them so they could say, we've complied with the investigation, which is not true. They talked to the people who were convinced for no good reason that they were not guilty. Linda Wilcox, a housekeeper, described the Ramseys upon finding a flood in their home. Has that ever happened to you? It's happened to me. Came back from vacation. Home was flooded. How's that? Patsy panicked, and John, says Linda Wilcox, looked furious, so filled with rage that his eyes almost changed color.
I can't believe this.
Over a flood.
Oh, my God.
The duct tape roll and any remainder of the cord used were never found in the Ramsey mansion. So an intruder breaks in, right? There's no evidence of a break-in. It snowed that night, no footprints. Intruder breaks in and kills JonBenet and uses duct tape and a cord, but removes that stuff but leaves the body. So like the intruder's going to try to cover up the evidence, removes the duct tape but leaves the body. A footprint 1 foot from the body, made in dust from a boot, could not be linked to any shoe in the house. This is the Ramseys needing to deflect attention.
Like you?
The 4.5-inch stick used in the ligature strangulation came from one of Mrs. Ramsey's paintbrushes found among her art supplies in the basement.
Like when you were there?
There were 4 fibers on the duct tape that have been linked to the red and black jacket that Patsy wore the night before. Of course. Oh, by the way, when Patsy greeted officers at 6 a.m. that morning, guess what she was wearing? the same jacket she had just worn to the Christmas party the night before, saying she had gone to bed. You go to bed, you get up in the morning, you dress. What, do you put on the same clothes you wore the night before to a party? Prosecutors often fail to convict parents who murder a child because most people cannot imagine committing such a crime. But Susan Smith drowned her 2 young boys. Thousands of parents have murdered their own children tragically. Countless fathers have molested their daughters. Such brutality does happen, and society's mindset has to change, or there will continue to be more such victims unnecessarily. As a 6-year-old beauty queen, JonBenet Ramsey was publicly sexualized by her parents, dressed provocatively, and coached to saunter like a seductress. That's wrong. You teach your daughter to dress like that and to behave like that? So Patsy Ramsey living her life through her little girl? If the Ramseys murdered their daughter, possible motives include parents blaming the daughter for their own sexual abuse of her, jealousy of the mother toward the daughter, sexual incident getting further out of hand than even planned, outburst of wrath after sexual assault unintentionally harms the child lethally. The actual murder then and the kidnap scheme came about to cover up the initial crimes. So much of the ransom note is inconceivable from the perspective of an intruder, such as the compliment of respect paid to the Ramsey business. It's of course inconceivable.
Of course.
But the clue that breaks the case is the phrase, "I advise you to be rested." No theory of an intruder can explain that phrase, nor much of the above evidence against the Ramseys. But that key phrase explains the evidence, both the damning and the exculpatory evidence both. And it's a little bit difficult to explain, but if you listen carefully, you'll understand this. You know, real events create all kinds of artifacts, evidence. And then you got to think hard to figure out, well, how are these artifacts explained by something that actually happened? That phrase, "I advise you to be arrested," shouts that the parents murdered their daughter, and then worked to throw the police off the trail. On that Christmas night, after Patsy put her son to bed, John began to sexually abuse his daughter. One form of destructive behavior led to another, and at midnight, in a burst of anger and emotion, Patsy struck her daughter in the head and cracked her skull. They realized the severity of the wound and that JonBenet was near dead. Neither wanted to be caught, so they began to conceal their crimes. First, they strangled JonBenet, which both gets rid of her and makes what would have been an accidental death appear to be deliberate. Makes it appear like somebody wanted to kill her. Then they planned to dispose of any damning evidence, but realized that without evidence pointing to someone else, they would be the only suspects. So if they were to survive, the resourceful Ramseys would have to rework the crime scene to point to an intruder. So they decide to write a ransom note, and what an absurd ransom note it is, which John began dictating to Patsy. As they wrote the note, they made mental notes about what evidence they must dispose of and what evidence they could gather and plant to divert attention. Their note had to take into account that it might take them hours to rework the crime scene. The neighbors may have already noticed the commotion and might watch the house or maybe even call 911. John needed to leave the house to dispose of the roll of duct tape that would have their fingerprints on it and the spool of cord and so on. Neighbors may notice them stirring in the house, or the neighbors might even see John driving away or returning in the wee hours of the morning. So how would that work? They tell the police, "We came home last night, we went to bed, We woke up this morning and our daughter had been kidnapped. Well, then why did you leave the house at 2 in the morning? Why did your neighbor see you driving back home at 3:30 a.m.? And so that was a risk for their effort to conceal the crime. So in their rush to cover up their crime, they tried to think through these issues. Even though they risked being seen, they were not ready to dump their best alibi. They needed to tell the police that they were asleep all night and heard nothing. That's what they needed to do. But their desperation to avert justice demanded that they try that alibi, that they were asleep. But so they planned to wake up at 6 a.m. and call the police. That's what they were going to do. Okay, in the morning, we'll call the police. But if a patrolling police officer or a neighbor saw John Ramsey up at 3 a.m., right? If they saw him even in the house or in the driveway, then the question is, what in the world, how could you be up if you were asleep when your daughter was being killed? So their wording in the note guarded against that risk. If that worst case scenario for them occurred, Patsy could then admit, it's true, we found the note last night. It's true. We were afraid to call the police because the note said they'd kill JonBenet if we did. So John rushed out in desperation to find JonBenet, and I searched through the house. Then when John returned, without her, we couldn't find her. We reread the note, and we realized it said we had to go to bed to get rest, so we went to bed. That is the only reason for that insane statement in the ransom note. We advise you to be well rested. No criminal is going to advise sleeping people to be well rested by 8 a.m. the next morning when they call. So that's part of their agenda to plant exculpatory evidence. So, I'm sorry, let me continue here.
Nervous?
So then they would say, we woke up, we realized we needed help. Even though we went to bed last night, we realized we did need help, so we called 911. But we thought it better not to mention that we had been up desperately looking for her last night. That's how they would spin it if they were seen setting the stage and leaving the home. So with that pretext, they went to work. John found a pair of unused shoes somewhere in the garage and made a footprint next to the body. He then took those shoes, the oversized underwear, the other damning evidence with him, like the duct tape, and he left the house around 1:30 in the morning. He went out to find a public restroom at a gas station, a diner, wherever. Somewhere along his journey, he dropped the damning evidence in the trash. At the restroom, he used the underwear that Patsy had recently purchased to pick up a pubic hair, one pubic hair from a public toilet. He picked up one.
How'd you know that?
And he rubbed a stain onto the underpants. Meanwhile, Patsy decided to rewrite the ransom note. Because, they had worked on it. She started the draft. They found that. She rewrote the note. And she authored the final personal contradictory lines. Don't try to grow a brain, John. Use that good Southern common sense of yours. It's up to you now, John. You can see her anger toward him. And that if it wasn't for him, none of this would have ever happened. Patsy then saw the broken ends of the paintbrush that John had overlooked, and she hid them among her art supplies. See, she then found that. He would have taken that too, along with the shoes and the duct tape. So she hid them. Later, Mr. Ramsey returned to the house, planted the lone pubic hair on the blanket, put the stained underwear on her body, and broke the basement window, even though there's no evidence of anybody coming in from outside, and disturbed the windowsill under it, which he later pointed out to his neighbor, Fleet White. The unidentifiable DNA material under the fingernails was likely collected by John,
Likely.
or even by a few days of normal child's play.
Or that too.
That material did not come from an intruder,
That's right.
which would have suggested that JonBenet fought and struggled, getting the attention of her neighbors, but not her brother or her parents. To help explain to the police how they could have slept through the attack, Patsy Ramsey had taped their daughter's mouth shut. Some may think that this plan is too involved for the Ramseys to pull off. But John had built a successful defense contracting business. That's pretty difficult to do. Patsy had long ago managed to become Miss West Virginia.
Wow, imagine that.
Further, they had help. You know, there's a book author and FBI criminal profiler, John Douglas. He wrote the book Mind Hunter, which reads in part like the JonBenet case in the use of duct tape, ligatures, and similar phrases in the ransom note. And John Douglas's book was found by the detectives in the Ramseys' bedroom. So when you're rushed, you're under pressure, and you're just thinking, and you just come up with things that are already in your head, that you put together into a story that you think you're going to outsmart everybody. After rechecking the crime scene, the Ramseys went to bed to rehash their story. Neither slept that night, neglecting their own advice.
So cute.
And that's the clue that breaks the case. So, without realizing that the Ramseys thought that they had to deflect attention and plant exculpatory evidence, then you have this mountain of evidence that shows that they're guilty, and just a very few easy-to-plant tiny bits of exculpatory evidence. With the mountain of evidence that shows that they should be convicted for murdering their daughter.
You should present that evidence to the cops.
And so once you realize that, then you simply think through, well, would there be a motive by the Ramseys to make it look like someone else had done this, and would it be difficult for them to pull this off? And actually, no. In their wickedness, they left the trail to help us understand what happened. But the Denver Post will tell you that the DNA showed that it did not belong to anyone in the Ramsey family.
It's true.
So that is reasonable doubt that anybody in that house killed that little girl. And that's simply false. It reminds me of the Denver Post somehow not being able to concentrate on the current Denver mayor having been a John of prostitutes.
That's you, dude.
How is it that they can't quite concentrate on that long enough to make it a significant story?
That's you.
Or the Jefferson County sheriff, denying the existence of the ignored search warrant application for Eric Harris's home prior to Columbine. And the sheriff lies and says there never was such a thing. And then, lo and behold, it's released to the public. What, 2 years later? And the Denver Post never quite finding it in their heart to make these points stand because they cover up for the elite.
You're tuned to AM 670, KLTT, Commerce City, Denver, KLTT HD, and streaming worldwide at 670kltt.com.